In late November of 1941, word had reached Washington, D.C. that Japan was probably preparing to enter war against the United States. On the morning of December the 7th, at what would be 4 o'clock in the morning, Hawaii time, in Washington, D.C., code breakers had figured out that, indeed, Japan was breaking off diplomatic ties with the United States at that point. As they continued to translate that long document, by 8 o'clock, or they knew that at 8 o'clock Hawaii time that there would be an attack somewhere. They did not know where the attack was going to be. They were expecting it was probably going to be against bases that the United States had in the Philippines. But then at 6:30 in the morning, the Ward, which was the destroyer that was set the all-time record for keel laying, the keel was laid in 14 days. That particular ship encountered a mini submarine, saw the periscope, saw the conning tower, and attacked it. They sank it. At 6:45 in the morning, they sent word to Pearl that they had indeed done this just outside of the harbor. But nothing happened to that particular notice, just as the idea that war was imminent, it was only sent over normal diplomatic channels, and it didn't reach them at Pearl until it was too late. And then at 7:02, because they had recently put in a radar system, the radar operator noticed a number of planes, large numbers of planes coming in from the northwest. It was not the proper direction for the group of B-17s that was being sent from the mainland, but once again, that was ignored. And so, there was the attack on Pearl Harbor. Completely unprepared for the attack. The planes had been lined up in rows in order to make it harder for saboteurs to attack them, but making it easy for them to be strafed by fighters. There had been no torpedo nets set out to protect the ships that were in the harbor. The only piece of good fortune was that because there had been bad weather, the aircraft carriers that had been sent out on maneuvers stayed out at sea because some of the destroyers could not handle the rough seas coming in to Pearl. And as a result, all of our aircraft carriers survived. There were ignored signs. And because of those ignored signs, there was an absolute catastrophe. Pearl Harbor long remains a day of infamy. Next slide. In the Gospel of John, at a wedding feast, we're going to find a fork in the road. At that particular moment, Jesus is going to reveal his glory. And there are going to be a number of people that will be surprised. They will not know what it is that Jesus is promising. They do not yet recognize who he is. But Jesus gives a sign. The first of his 8 signs, and next slide. In review, what we have seen is that John the Baptist, Jesus' disciples in chapter 1, as well as the 8 signs in the Gospel of John, all point to Jesus as the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who gives life to those who believe in him. He gives everlasting life as a gift. That is what the Gospel of John is all about. is pointing people towards Jesus Christ that they might believe in him and have everlasting life. Let's get a little bit of geographic background. Next slide. There was a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. You notice that I've marked Nazareth, which is about a 3-hour walk from there, and that is where Mary would come to this. And as we have talked about earlier, Jesus and his disciples were in Bethania, and they had a one-day trip. We've talked earlier about that. And then at the end of the passage, John chapter 2, verse 12, all of them go over to Capernaum, over by the Sea of Galilee. What I want you to make note of is it is a 3-hour journey walking between Nazareth and Cana. Well, let's start here at the passage with John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Now, Jesus' mother was there. The reference here to it being the third day is we've had a 7-day sequence that started in John chapter 1, verse 19, and there was a 2-day gap. We argued that that was the day before this was a Sabbath. It's not a reference to the day of the week, but it's the third day in a sequence. There's a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And do notice, Jesus' mother was there. But furthermore, Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. I believe that the invitation had taken place somewhere during Jesus' stay before John chapter 1, verse 19, where he went down and then met John the Baptist. I think that this is a long-standing invitation. It isn't that Jesus and his disciples were party crashers. It isn't that because all of a sudden extra people show up, whoops, we didn't order enough food. By the way, that's a good reason if you're planning to come to the senior lunch to make sure that Dixie has your reservation ahead of time. But Jesus was not a party crasher. I believe that he already knew about this, had already accepted the invitation, and the timetable that he was working on was so that he would be here at this wedding. Now, let's move on to verse 3. So, when the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, they don't have any wine. Now, is she just raising a point of interest? Wow, can you imagine it? These people didn't plan. They didn't plan for enough people here, so they ran out of wine. Is she just raising idle curiosity, or does she have something more in mind? Well, actually, the evidence is that she has something more in mind, and let's go to verse 4. Jesus said to her, "Woman, how does that concern me and you? My time has not yet come." Some people look at this and they say, "Woman, is that any way for someone to talk to his mother?" Well, actually, it was much more accepted in the first century, and we have other passages in the Gospel of John that are quite evidently polite. Take a look at John chapter 19 with me, where Jesus is on the cross. Oops, I better not pick up this Russian one. I don't read Russian very well. That's for later. John chapter 19. In John 19, verse 26, Jesus commits his mother Mary to the care of the Apostle John. We'll start at verse 25. Meanwhile, standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. So when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, there's your son." And he said to the disciple, "There's your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. This is a polite address. we wouldn't use it. This isn't our normal way of referring to our mothers. I would have never thought of calling my mother woman. But this was accepted. And then if we look in John chapter 20, when Mary Magdalene speaks with the two angels, we have the same thing that comes up. John chapter 20, verses 13 and 15. And let's see. Print on this is a little small to see the numbers. Let's see, we'll start at verse 11. But Mary stood outside opposite the tomb crying. Then as she was crying, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet where Jesus' body had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Because they have taken away my Lord," she told them, "and I don't know where they put him." And having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. "Woman," Jesus said to her, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" So, although this is strange to our ears, it was polite. It's not to be taken as a rude statement, although I wouldn't recommend that people address their mother as woman. It's probably not a very wise idea. Now, next thing that I'd like to point out here is that Jesus had a two-part response to her. The first thing he said is, "How does that concern me and you?" Literally he says, "What to me and to you?" But the second part of it is, "My time has not yet come." That's a common motif that we find in the Gospel of John. We find it on a number of occasions. In the notes, I have given you other passages where that shows up. John chapter 6, 8, and 9, Jesus says his time, or his hour, literal translation, has not yet come. But then in John chapter 12, which is only a matter of hours until he faces the cross, he says that his time has come. This is not an incidental or throwaway statement. When Jesus says his hour has not yet come, he is talking about the hour of his glorification. And I would take it that Mary has already seen that Jesus is special. After all, she knows that he wasn't born in the ordinary way. She knows that the angel has made announcement to her. And she knows that John the Baptist was supposed to announce Jesus. What do you bet she has seen some signs? What do you bet? I'm sure of it. I think that she's saying something more than, "Hey, could you go down to the 7-Eleven and get them some wine?" I don't think that's what her point is. I think her point is, "Jesus, you know you can take care of it." And he says, "It's not yet my time. I know you want me to rise to the top of the class. I know you want everyone to recognize who I am, but it's not yet my time." So then one has to ask, since she apparently has more in mind, then why is it that Jesus would say this to her and then immediately proceed to do the sign? Well, my third point here, Jesus did help Mary. He met her need. But he did so on the Father's timetable. All the way through John, Jesus is always saying that he's following the Father's timetable. And the Father's timetable coincided with Mary's need. So, let's consider verse 5. In verse 5, Mary orders the servants to obey him. Now, for someone to come up to someone else's servants and say, you do exactly what he tells you to do, is probably not the normally accepted etiquette. So, this is where it becomes important to note we have Mary, who is a poor woman, and she has made a 3-hour journey to come here and will have a 3-hour journey back home, if she were to go home, which she won't. She's going to go with Jesus over to Capernaum. She makes a 3-hour trip. I would argue that she is related to the groom. This is a relative, and because of that, she's able to say, you do what he says. She can tell someone else's servants to do so. Why is it that I see her as being related to the groom rather than to the bride? Well, there are a couple of details here in the passage that aim us in that direction. The first thing is that it would be customary for the groom's family to put on the feast. And furthermore, notice what happens when the master of ceremonies becomes puzzled over this very excellent wine that was served late. Look at verses 9 and 10. Now when the master of ceremonies had tasted the water after it had become wine and didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, he called the bridegroom and told him, everybody sets out the fine wine first. Then, after people are intoxicated, the inferior, but you have kept the fine wine until now. He is treating the groom as the one who ought to know why it is that they're serving the fine wine instead of why they are serving inferior wine later. This is arguing that the groom's family is the one who has provided the wine. I would suggest Mary is a relative of the groom. Okay. A lot of people look at this passage and they say, where's Joseph? Well, he was probably over in Sepphoris. Sepphoris is a nearby town, never mentioned in the New Testament, but Sepphoris was Herod's first capital in the area of Galilee. And there were major building projects, and I would argue that Joseph, along with a lot of other Judeans, moved north in order to be able to work. There was economic opportunity in Sepphoris. I suggest that Joseph was at work, and the reason for that is because John 6:42 is written from the standpoint that Joseph was still alive. I think he was just at work. In John 6:42, there are Judeans that say that we know Joseph and Mary. They don't say we knew him. We know them. It seems that Joseph is still alive. I wouldn't go to the bank on that, but that's what I would assume. So, now we get to verse 6. In verse 6, there were 6 stone water jars set there for Judean purification. The word that's translated Jew in the Gospel of John, I would argue, should be Judean every single time. I have a student that just completed a master's thesis under my direction in which he argued that very point. There were 6 stone water jars set there for Judean purification. It's a Judean wedding. Judean people are involved. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. Now, the fact that they are stone means that they are very expensive. This is much more expensive than jars that are made out of pottery. But for purification purposes, stone was always regarded as superior to clay. And the reason for that is because the Mishnah tells us that the possibility exists if you had clay that there could be a dead body 1 foot away. But if you have stone, what's the likelihood of there being a dead body under it? So therefore the Jews said that stone was purer than clay, and therefore it was a higher degree of cleansing basis. Now, you might think, 120 to 180 gallons of water, that's a lot of water. But this is not at all extravagant, because people would need to ritually wash their hands before they would eat, and they would serve a lot of people. And so they need to have a lot of water here for the ritual cleansing before the people would eat. And it would require a minimum of about a gallon per washing, so it doesn't take long and you've used up large amounts of water. Now what we see in verse 7 is that Jesus wants the water filled to the brim. So he says, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Now what's the point of having it full to the brim? Well, it isn't that Jesus put in some additives and now all of a sudden we've got wine. We start out with containers that are full, ready to overflow, and without adding anything to it, suddenly it becomes wine. But furthermore, in the passage, who is it that touches the water? Who is it that touches the containers? Jesus never does so. Now the fact that we have a large amount here, Jesus has turned between 120 and 180 gallons of water into wine, showing it was no sleight of hand. It wasn't a magician's trick. And furthermore, it was fine wine. In the movie, I thoroughly enjoyed the expression on the servant's face when, in the next verse, Jesus said to take some of this water to the master of ceremonies. Verse 8, then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. So they took it. Now can you imagine? Here's someone expecting some wine, some fine wine, and they're going to give him some water? Water that was used for washing hands? Can you imagine what kind of a reception they would get from that master of ceremonies? And can you imagine them coming up and saying, some wine, sir? And here's water. On the left-hand side here, I'm showing what the servants are thinking. They're thinking, I've got water, I'm going to give it to him, and oops, I'm going to get boiled alive. But instead, they have been delivered by Jesus. And it's wine. Very interesting thinking through the process. By the way, did you notice the 20th century intervention into the film? A lot of the cups were translucent. They looked like they were made out of plastic. Somehow, I don't think that they had plastic back in those days. Well, this meant in verse 9 that the clueless master of ceremonies asked the unaware groom, how did this come about? So in verse 9, now when the master of ceremonies had tasted the water after it had become wine and didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, he called the bridegroom. So it's like, something is odd here. And he's puzzled, so he says, well, I think the man in charge is the groom. So he goes to the groom and he has a question for him. Well, let's find out what the question is. Next slide. He asks him why it is that he served the best last. Now, a couple of things here. This really was wine. This was not grape juice. First of all, if you had grape juice and you wanted to keep it grape juice, you'd need an ice box. But I don't think they had refrigeration in those days. Secondly, as we work out the chronology of the Gospel of John, this is quite a while after the harvest. So there would have been a time that grape juice, even if intended to remain grape juice, would have become fermented. Third point is that since they did not have water treatment, water to drink was risky unless boiled. Furthermore, we notice in verse 10 that the master of ceremonies speaks about intoxication. He says in verse 10, everybody sets out the fine wine first. Then, after people are intoxicated, the inferior. But you have kept the fine wine until now. The fact that everything's upside down, everything's backwards, and it's not what was expected is the thing that calls attention to Jesus' sign. Because what people would do is they would try to impress all their friends and neighbors and everyone who came to the wedding. They would buy the most expensive wine that they could buy. And then after a while, they'd have some of the cheaper stuff. And this master of ceremony says, what gives here? You aren't doing it the way that everybody else does this. So now we're going to track the wine's origin. The first thing that happened in verses 9 and 10 was the master of ceremonies asked the groom, okay, why did you do this? And the groom says, you got me. He hasn't tasted it. He doesn't know what it is. He has not a clue. Plus, he's probably more concerned about the person sitting next to him. I mean, after all, it is his wedding day. So someone, either the bridegroom or the master of ceremonies, asked the servants, okay, where did you get this from? And the servants, who we are told in verse 9, knew exactly what had happened, because here they are thinking that they're bringing water, and it turns out that suddenly it's wine. They asked them, and they would say, ask Jesus. So then, as a result of that, we would say the master of ceremonies, the groom, the bride, Mary, Jesus' brothers, and his disciples all learned that Jesus had made the wine. So even though what the servants were carrying they thought was water, they gave it to the master of ceremonies and thought it still was water, and then it suddenly is wine. Even though you say, well, who actually saw it happen? Everybody knew what had happened. Can you imagine them talking about this? They would be saying, can you imagine what Jesus just did? This has become very public, and you can imagine how it is spreading all over the place. People are learning of what has happened. So, in verse 11, what we have is a summary of this first sign of Jesus displaying his glory and of his disciples believing in him. Now, this is his first Galilean sign, as we are told in verse 11. This first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee and thus displayed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. At this point, we have evidence that he has 5 disciples. He gradually was collecting other disciples, but at this point, he has 5 of them. But I'd like for you to think back to John chapter 1:14 that we talked about. John chapter 1, verse 14 says, the Word, Jesus Christ, became flesh and dwelt among us. And do you remember what that word was for dwelt? It's the idea of dwelling in a tent, tabernacling. And we beheld his glory. What kind of glory? The same kind of Shekinah glory that God had displayed in the Old Testament. So when it speaks of glory, it is a demonstration that he is God. And yet, to all appearances, he's man. He is God and he is man. And he is manifesting who he is, and that is the purpose of the signs, so that people would come to understand who he is, the Christ, the Son of God, the one who gives everlasting life to those who believe in him for it. So, we are told that his first 5 disciples believed in him. That is the appropriate response to a sign that has come from God, a messianic sign. But now the question is, what does a sign signify? You know, if you see one of those STOP signs on the corner, you don't say, "Oh, that's nice yard art." It signifies that you don't have the right of way through the intersection. And if you don't pay attention to the sign, a greater catastrophe awaits. Signs signify a greater truth. And each of the 8 signs points to Jesus as the life-giving, messianic Son of God. And even the 8th sign, the cross and resurrection, points to Jesus as the life-giver. And with that pointing, the clear expectation is for people to believe in him for everlasting life. Next slide. Now, this is slightly out of order from your notes. I prepare my notes early and then I work on my PowerPoint later, so I have changed this for the sequence. We do need, on this passage, to have a little excursus on the concept of alcohol and drugs. First, the Bible does not forbid alcohol, but it does regulate it. In other words, there are people who should not drink at all, and those who drink should do so within the guidelines that the Bible gives. For example, in Ephesians 5:18, the Bible does prohibit being drunk. And in keeping with 1 Corinthians 6:12, where Paul says that all things are lawful to me, but not all things are profitable, I will not be enslaved by anything. It makes it clear that problem drinkers, those who can't stay away from it once they've had the first sniff, they need to stay away from it. Furthermore, underage drinking is against the law, so therefore those under the legal age, need to stay away from it. Furthermore, driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated also breaks the law. Romans 13, once again, challenges us that we need to obey the law. Perhaps the most important point, 1 Corinthians and also Romans chapter 14, believers who are stronger have no right to cause a weaker believer to sin, encouraging them to do something that is against their conscience. So when I say the Bible does not forbid alcohol, we do note the Bible has regulations on it. This is an area where there is freedom, but there is freedom within the bounds of what the Bible sets forth. Now, people often tell me, well, the Bible talks about alcohol, but it doesn't talk about drugs. Wrong. Those who know their Greek will find that there are passages like Galatians 5:20 and Revelation 18:13, which our English Bibles have translated sorcery, but the word is pharmakeia, and it's talking about mind-altering drugs. In the process of sorcery, mind-altering drugs which were available in the first century were used. The Bible does prohibit those. And that would also come under breaking of the law. Let's now look at verse 12. As we noted, verse 11, the first Galilean sign that Jesus did, displayed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. But we get quite another response from his brothers, his half-brothers, who we are told in John chapter 7 that they still were unbelievers, even as late in his ministry as John chapter 7, which is 6 months before his crucifixion. They marched to a different drummer. They're going their own direction. They are not following Jesus. They would not do very well in the choir. They're going their own direction. But notice, we've said that people would have been talking all over the place about this miraculous sign that Jesus did. But in contrast to that, in verse 12 it says, after this, he, with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, went down to Capernaum. But they did not stay there many days. Now, can you imagine the disciples have their lips zipped and no talking? They weren't talking about what happened at the wedding. Mary wasn't talking about it either, was she? But here are Jesus' brothers, and they were at the wedding because this is a relative of Mary's, so it's a relative of theirs that got married. And they've seen Jesus perform this sign, and they don't believe. The reason this verse is here is to show us they walked all the way to Capernaum, a full day's walk. And then they stayed there for a while before returning to Nazareth. They've had lots of opportunity to talk about what they saw, and it didn't affect them at all. So, tying this together, just like as we look at this picture that was taken of Pearl Harbor in October 1941, there you see Battleship Row, all the ships lined out to be struck in a sneak attack. There were all the warning signs that kept pointing, this is a dangerous thing to do. They were not living in a friendly world. Interestingly enough, in late 1941, there was a Gallup poll taken. 52% of Americans expected to enter war with Japan. 27% said no. And 21%, who knows? We live in a world where we have a lot of people who have no clue that they need everlasting life from Jesus Christ. And just like there was opportunity to prepare the forces to defend themselves at Pearl Harbor, we have the opportunity to help prepare a world that is unprepared. In conclusion, I'd like to show you a friend of mine, George Bryson. He is responsible for planting 100 plus churches in the former Soviet Union. Now, this is the Russian Living Water, and you'll notice a major difference between it and the English version. It basically hides in a pocket. The reason that they made them that short was so that Russian soldiers would accept them, because if they had something sticking out, they were out of uniform, and they'd get into trouble with their superior officers. George told me on this particular occasion that the churches that they planted using the Gospel of John, using the living water, the Russian living water, stayed firm with the message of grace. There were other churches that they planted and they did everything else the same, but they didn't found the church on the Gospel of John. And most of them have crept back into the Russian Orthodox viewpoint, not understanding the gospel of grace. The Gospel of John is the message we want to share with a lost and dying world. Please don't be bookkeepers. Give your books away. We have lots more. We'll never run out. But we have a world that needs to know that Jesus proved through his signs that he is the life-giving Messiah, the Son of God. And we have opportunity to share the message of life with a lost and dying world. Let's pray.